Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second event of our Andrés Bello postdoctoral fellow, Sebastián Figueroa. It has been an honor to have him affiliated with our center and with NYU this semester. This year, we exceptionally redefined our KJC and Andrés Bello Chair as postdoctoral fellowships in an effort to address the challenges facing emerging scholars because of the pandemic. As a result, the KJCC has found itself with two exceptional fellows who are leading us this semester in rich, layered conversations about issues of great importance. The events organized by our KJC postdoctoral fellow, Diego Baena, are available for viewing on the KJCC Facebook and YouTube channels. And Sebastian's first event, a roundtable on vegetal plots in Latin American literature, is also posted on our channels and has garnered over 1,000 views. Now, I know we're not just talking about clicks or views, there's actually great meaning to this because it shows how generous people have been in joining us in these vital conversations online over the past year, and we are very grateful. Together, the research that Diego and Sebastian have shared this year have nourished our programs and introduced our publics to new, exciting scholarship, which we continue today with Sebastian's final event for us, a lecture titled Toxic Agriculture, Transgenic Seeds, Pesticides, and Monoculture in Contemporary Fiction from Latin America. A presentation which begins with Andrés Bello's Silva a la agricultura de la zona tórrida and the social and ecological contradictions of capitalist agriculture in Latin America from its inception in the 19th century to its industrialization during the Green Revolution and corporatization in neoliberalism, and continues with a discussion of contemporary novels centered around rural and suburban landscapes to examine the role of monoculture and transgenic crops in the precarization of labor relations, gender violence, and environmental degradation in Latin America during the last decades. Sebastian's lecture will be followed by a response by Professor Gisela Heffes and a moderated discussion with Professor Jens Andermann. This afternoon's program is co-sponsored with generous support from the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and we invite you to put your questions and comments in the chat box to the right of the Facebook Live screen. For anyone not logged into Facebook, you can send your comments or questions to the following email, kjc.info@nyu.edu. Before we start our program, I would like to share a little about each of today's speakers. Sebastián Figueroa, as I mentioned, is our Andrés Bello postdoctoral fellow here at KJCC and is currently working on a book manuscript titled Poéticas de la Extracción, Literatura, Naturaleza y Capitalismo en América Latina, in which he analyzes the relationship between capitalist development, resource extraction, and ecological crisis in Latin American literature from the 20th and 21st centuries. Gisela Heffes, who's an associate professor of Latin American literature at Rice University, is a writer and the co-editor of the Latin American Ecocultural Reader and the volume Pushing Past the Human in Latin American Cinema. Her most recent fictions are Sophie Labelle, a bilingual novella with images from 2016, the novel Cocodrillos en la Noche, and the bilingual poetry collection El Cero Móvil de su Boca, the zero mobile of its mouth. Jens Andermann is a professor here with us at the Department of Spanish and Portuguese in NYU, and he writes about modern Latin American art, film, literature, and architecture, and material culture at the intersections with extractivism and the legacies of coloniality. He is an editor of the Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies and the author of Tierras en Trance, Arte y Naturaleza Después del Paisaje, New Argentine Cinema, The Optics of the State, Visuality and Power in Argentina and Brazil, and Mapas de Poder, Una Arqueología Literaria del Espacio Argentino. In addition to editing several anthologies and curatorial work, his essays have appeared in journals like Memory Studies, Cinema Journal, Journal of Material Culture, and Theory, Culture, and Society, among others. I would like to now turn the round table over to Sebastian, and again, invite you all to put your comments and questions in the chat so that we can be brought into conversation later during our moderated discussion. Sebastian?
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation, that introduction, Jordana. First, I want to say thank you to the King Juan Carlos First of Spain Center for this fellowship, to continue my research and present my work, and especially to Jordana and Laura for making me feel so welcome in the last months. I also want to say thank you to Jens Andermann and Gisela Heffes for agreeing to participate in this lecture. Gisela's book, Políticas de la Destrucción, Poéticas de la Conservación, and Jens' book, Tierras en Trance, are very significant to me and my research. So it's really an honor to have them here today. And I'm gonna dive right into the lecture because it's a little bit long. Okay, in this lecture, I seek to analyze the representation of monoculture, pesticides, and transgenic seeds in contemporary Latin American fiction. My goal is to show how literature can be a way to understand the alienation of food production in global capitalism and to imagine possible ways to get out of this crisis. I will structure my presentation in two main parts. In the first part, I will give a brief historical overview about how Latin American literature has represented agricultural capitalism from its inception in the 19th century to its industrialization in the 20th century. In this part, I will focus mostly, as Jordana mentioned, on the Andrés Bello's Silva a la agricultura de la zona tórrida, to show how the notion of toxic agriculture is the outcome of a certain way of seeing agriculture as a capitalist enterprise, a masculine, military, and commercial view that predominated over other forms of farming throughout modernization. In the second part, I will discuss examples of what I call novel of agribusiness. I will focus on a group of novels from Chile, Argentina, and Colombia, three countries subjected to different forms of plantation capitalism throughout their history. From logging and export fruits in the case of Chile, to cereal and soy in the case of Argentina, and sugarcane and oil palm in the case of Colombia. My goal here is to analyze how these novels blur the boundaries between the real and the unreal to mediate the ecological imbalances created by monoculture and toxicity. For the first part of this lecture, I would like to begin with a wordplay between the words torrid and toxic, based on Andrés Bello's foundational poem, Silva, la agricultura de la zona tórrida. And I want to mention quickly that my analysis of this poem is based on wonderful interpretation by scholars such as Julio Ramos, Álvaro Canfer, and Leslie Wiley, among other critics that have read this beautiful but difficult poem. Written during Bello's exile in England in 1826, this poem celebrates agriculture as a means to secure the process of independence in America. The poem begins by praising America as a fertile and sunny land of prominent crops such as maize, yucca, grapes, sugar, indigo, pineapple, and banana. However, these crops, especially the banana, represented for Bello the backwardness also of the colonial period, in which neither the master nor the slave have freed themselves from nature. For this reason, Bello demands to transform the fertile land into a more productive soil through agriculture, inviting the independent Americans to stop fighting each other and ignore the fallacious noise of the city, where men like to dress in feminine ways, and go back to cultivate the country, which is the real source of wealth and freedom. For Bello, the war of independence was over, and now was the time of productivity. In this way, his poem represents a transition from an idealistic to a more technical view of nature, in which agriculture will be for the countryside what grammar is for the language. La Silva a la agricultura de la zona tórrida was written following the classic model of Virgil's Georgics, which intended to praise farming life against the vices of the city. However, in his poem, Bello suggests that violence towards nature is necessary to accomplish the mission of agricultural revolution. He asks the independent citizens to become a troop of farmers and convert the wild soil in the new slave of human labor. This poem celebrates the fire that breaks through the thick forest and the hatchet that knocks down the trees, including cutting down the ceibo, the sacred ancient tree that represents the indigenous past of the Americans. In this fashion, Bello encourages Americans to continue the violent conquest of the continent in the independent period, replacing the savage plants with organized rows of prosperous crops. And I quote from the poem, al vulgo bravío de las tupidas plantas montaraces, sucede ya el fructífero plantío, muestra ufana de ordenadas haces. As we can see, Bello's poem represents one of the foundational capital fictions of Latin America, that nature is the primordial commodity of the continent, and that, as Erika Beckman puts it, export-led modernization will create vast wealth for nations. His poem also conveys what Ellen Maxine-Wood has called the ideology of agricultural improvement in the 19th century, which saw agriculture as an economic practice that must be improved to produce for profit rather than subsistence. In her words, if we want to look for the roots of a destructive modernity, the ideology, say, of technocentrism and ecological degradation, we might start by looking in the project of improvement, the subordination of all human values to productivity and profit. There is in general a great disparity between the productive capacity of capitalism and the quality of life it delivers. This means, among other things, that people who could be fed are often left to starve. Maxine-Wood is referring mainly to the fact that agricultural improvement is linked to the development of monoculture as a way to engage with global capital. And monocultures are like machines that organize farming in just one direction, the direction of profit, generating an increase in the privatization of land and a decrease in agricultural diversity and food sustenance. Directed by profit, monocultures also provoke what Karl Marx calls the metabolic rift between society and nature as a result of the increment of productivity beyond the physical capacities of nature to self-replenish. This is particularly important to address two structural divisions of capitalism. One between town and country, and the other between industrial centers and agrarian peripheries. As Nancy Fraser explains in reference to the first, unsustainable, profit-driven farming in the countryside exacerbated the metabolic rift between town and country. Nutrients plundered from rural soil were not returned at the point of extraction, but discharged into urban waterways as organic waste. With the globalization of capitalism, the metabolic rift too becomes global, creating, in the words of Marx, a new and international division of labor, suited to the requirements of the main industrial countries, and it converts one part of the globe into a chiefly agricultural field of production for supplying the other part. This international division of labor is perhaps the most important thing about agricultural development in Latin America. The conversion with colonial undertones of the region into a supplier of food for the benefit of the metropolitan cores, assuming the environmental cost of profit-driven agriculture. This will be the main reason behind the slow but violent transition of our agriculture to global capitalism in Latin America after the independence period. And I say slow and violent because despite Bello's call to go back to the country and make it productive, Latin American agricultural development in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century can be better described as a gradual cycle of extraction and expropriation of resources from rural populations without ever reaching a stage of advanced development. The persistence of colonial institutions such as the hacienda and relations of labor based on debt bondage, as well as archaic techniques and limited circulation, kept the countryside in a state of underdevelopment. This created a hegemonic narrative of Latin American modernization as a long path from the regressive country to the progressive city. This was also one of the central topics of mid-20th century novels like Jorge Casa, Guasipungo, Rómulo Gallegos, Doña Bárbara, Juan Rulfo, Pedro Páramo, and José Donoso's El Lugar Sin Límites, all of which criticize the isolation and archaism of the country. However, the unfinished transition of rural Latin America to capitalism, to quote Erika Beckman again, is the result of processes of uneven development, in which the Latin American country remains a periphery of the center. For this reason, rural literature of the mid-20th century might be viewed rather than as the expression of pre-capitalist reality in the country, as a way to register the uneven dynamics of rural modernization within paradigms of peripheral capitalist development and accumulation. One of the main consequences of uneven development is the reproduction of relations of economic dependence and imperialism between periphery and center. This cycle was supposed to end with the arrival of the Green Revolution, which introduced drastic changes towards the industrialization of Latin American agriculture, like synthetic fertilization, genetic manipulation, mechanization, use of chemical pesticides, a new social relation based on corporate labor. These changes were implemented thanks to alliances between international institutions such as the World Bank and the Rockefeller Foundation with Latin American governments. Although in reality, the Green Revolution represented a new form of imperialism by means of financial and technological dependence, especially to fossil fuels, bank credits, and genetically modified seeds. However, as Vandana Shiva has explained in the context of Latin America and India, the Green Revolution must be better understood as a process of maldevelopment based on imposition of globalization, seed imperialism, and the monoculture of the mind. The ideologically constructed category of Western technological men as the uniform measure of the worth of classes, cultures, and genders. The missing link in the implementation of Green Revolution in the Americas was violence, this time from the state in collusion with civil organizations and agricultural corporations towards rural movements that were chasing land reform and self-organization in the 60s and 70s. Furthermore, the brutality of state-sponsored terrorism in the country not only secured the conditions for a capitalist reorganization of agriculture in these years, but also opened the road for the intensified appropriation of food production in the neoliberal era. And this is the period, the neoliberal period, where I want to focus now in the second part of the lecture. But I hope that it was clear from this historical overview how the notion of toxic agriculture that I'm using to understand the place of agricultural capitalism in contemporary fiction is the outcome of a certain way to see agriculture as a fundamentally monocultural and commercial practice in which food production is alienated from the basic sustenance of life, and the expansion of the agricultural frontier is made through processes of accumulation by dispossession, creating zones of toxic exclusion in the countryside. In other words, agriculture of the toxic rather than the torrid zone. Let me proceed now with the second part of this lecture. In the last 2 decades, we observed an important number of literary texts that engage with the increasing presence of cash crop plantations and its devastating socio-environmental effects in Latin America. Some of these texts are Lina Meruanes' Fruta Podrida, Mario Verdugo's La Novela Terrígena, Samantha Schweblin's Distancia de Rescate, among others. For the purpose of this presentation, I would call them novels of agribusiness and poetry of agribusiness too, because they are in one way or another shaped by a certain type of industrial farming that is not only dependent on monoculture, chemical pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, and transgenic seeds, but also has unclear ties with external forces that regulate what happens in the daily life of people that live near the plantations. This novel of agribusiness can also be understood as part of a broader term in recent Latin American literature and arts towards rural areas, as sites of social and environmental violence. Focusing on the specific case of Argentina, Gisela Heffes argues that this rural term not only articulates a rearrangement of the rural-urban opposition, in which the city has become barbaric and the countryside docile, but furthermore, the rural landscape has become domesticated by the unfettered use of monoculture, be they soy or wheat, and by the use of Pampean soil as an artificial laboratory where the global economy and an increasingly unregulated state intervene, thereby objectifying it. And following this idea, I argue that novels of agribusiness represent the countryside as a site of experimentation in which alien, usually invisible forces artificially manipulate the ecological and social conditions of the territory to foster the production of agricultural commodities. By the same token, the country is converted into a place where accidents and mutations can occur, a zone of toxic exclusion where both human and non-human entities are subjected to chemical violence. From this perspective, I believe that the novels of agribusiness can also be understood as a way to register the neo-extractive turn of agriculture in recent decades, which is defined by Maristela Vampa as a process of reorientation of Latin American economies towards primary extractive activities, accompanied by the loss of food sovereignty, a fact linked to the export of food on large scale, whose destination is animal consumption or increasingly the production of biofuels, ranging from soybeans to palm crops. This neo-extractive turn is grounded first on the privatization of natural resources under neoliberalism, which enabled the propagation of monocultures in rural areas, and second, the commodification of genetic information, which means that capitalism is able to intervene in biological processes. As Vandana Shiva has put it, global corporations are merging across traditional boundaries of the pharmaceutical, biotechnology, agribusiness, food, chemical, cosmetics, and energy sectors to form the life sciences industry. As chemical companies combine to control the living resources of the planet, they also control the sectors most basic to life. This means that the metabolic rift between society and nature not only has worsened, but as John Bellamy Foster has claimed, human economic processes began to rival the ecological cycle of the planet, opening up for the first time the real possibility of planet-wide ecological disaster. In the rest part of the lecture, I will analyze three novels in particular: Alina Meruane's Fruta Podrida, Samantha Schweblin's Distancia de Rescate, and Juan Cárdenas' El Diablo de las Provincias. I will focus first on the specific ways that labor, gender, and nature are organized in these novels. Second, I will examine how the capacity of capitalism to intervene in all stages of food production generates a crisis in the process of reproduction of life. As I said in the introduction, my goal is to read these novels as expression of the ecological imbalances produced by agribusiness on a global scale, which means, as Sheree Decker has put it, to read them as not merely as mimetic representations of environmental discourses, landscape of problems, but as environmentally embedded, structurally marked at the level of imagery, style, and form by the ruptures and rifts of ecological revolutions. In this specific case, I'm interested in how this set of novels from Chile, Argentina, and Colombia blur the boundaries between the real and the unreal to mediate the crisis created by the appropriation of food by capital. Lina Meruane's dystopic novel, Fruta Podrida, is the perfect way to start. This novel tackles on the abuses of the fruit industry towards women through the story of two half sisters who live in Ojo Seco, a rural town brutally transformed into a homogeneous landscape of plantations and storehouses where profit is the most important aspect of social life. The town also exhibits a state-of-the-art hospital where the preservation of life through transplants and other techniques is also the main goal of the healthcare system. Production of commodities and production of life overlap in this town that can be taken as a version of Chile's own transformation into an important supplier of fruits for the world markets after the dictatorship. At the same time, the novel exposes the violence towards one of the preconditions of this economic transformation in Chile, the massive integration of women to labor force as temporeras, that is, seasonal underpaid workers that pick, select, and pack the clean, fresh, and always ripe Chilean fruits that we find in the supermarkets around the world. The story of the novel centers around the conflictive relationship between Maria and Zoila, who also appear almost like the two opposites of just one person. Maria works for the fruit industry as a dedicated plague supervisor, where she's called the company's pesticide because of her absolute commitment to the extermination of all kinds of plagues that could affect the production of fruit. And let me quote from the novel. María va leyendo las etiquetas de los químicos que aniquilarán las futuras y presentes plagas, los hongos ocultos bajo la corteza de los troncos, las malezas que estrangulan las raíces de los árboles, los guarenes nadadores de los canales de regadío. Todos deben ser destruidos por ella para que la fruta engorde, para que los duraznos peludos y pelados y también los damascos crezcan perfectos. De atrás quedará solo la fruta caída, la fruta picada por los pájaros o mordida hasta el hueso por implacables gusanos. This passage reveals the kind of violence that agribusiness directs towards forms of life that can hamper the production of commodities. The passage also reveals that, as Vandana Shiva argues, every tool of the current system of food production was designed for war. This is particularly significant for the fruit industry in Chile, which is grounded on the political persecution and even chemical attacks that the dictatorship conducted towards its dissidents. Maria's sister Zoila, on the other hand, is a lazy and messy woman that loves eating fruits at all times until she is diagnosed with a strange immunological disease because of high consumption of sugar. The illness, very similar to diabetes, produces unconsciousness and weakness in Zoila, who is depicted as a fruit in a state of fermentation. Maria has to take care of her sister while they wait for a pancreatic transplant, controlling her diet with severity, but Zoila resists every measure of control, succumbing to her desire of sugar. And I quote, mientras ella produce fruta perfecta ya en el campo, yo produzco azúcar en mi cuerpo. In this way, Zoila represents the opposite of the ideology of productivity in neoliberal Chile, which is the bad apple that can contaminate the whole system of discipline and efficiency behind the success of the fruit industry. This is also the role of Zoila's journal, Cuaderno de Descomposición. The journal registers Zoila's addiction to sugar, as well as the capacity of poetic language to infect the novel and ideologies of progress in general. The journal also reveals another aspect of Zoila's behavior. She's not just a dissident, she's also the result of a transformation in food consumption generated by neoliberalism, in which alternative forms of eating have been replaced by junk food. In this way, food represents the same type of contradiction explored recently by Julio Ramos in relation to drugs. On the one hand, they can be used to maximize productivity of the human body, but they also create sick, unproductive, addict subjects. And according to Meruane's novel, the same can be said about food, or as Zoila puts it, mis neuronas piden desesperadamente azúcar, azúcar, una y muchas veces azúcar, 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 azúcar. At this point, the novel introduces a different sort of question. What does it happen when not just food, but also medicine is reorganized only for profit? In other words, what does it happen when not only production, but also reproduction is perverted by capitalism? And this is the dilemma posed by Maria when she decides to get pregnant and sell her babies to the hospital in order to pay for Zoila's treatment and stop taking care of her. She compares motherhood to the labor performed by the workers at the fruit plant. And I quote, un trabajo transitorio, pensó, el trabajo de ser madre también debía ser. La maternidad solo era soportable por una temporada, sin contrato fijo. We learn at this point that this is a common practice in Ojo Seco. The temporeras are hired by the hospital to produce children that would be traded in the international market to satisfy the demand of organs and tissues from the metropolitan centers. And this market operates within a strict global division of labor. The South provides the raw material and the North consumes them. The hospital is also fully integrated with the fruit company to exploit both the hands and the wombs of these women, using hormones and supplements to keep them healthy, to obtain more children and fruits, which will be used to feed and preserve the life of people from other more privileged zones. As we can see, the town of Ojo Seco in Meruane's novel emerges as a place entirely organized for the extraction of value, where both nature and people have been commodified and the market ideology has perverted even reproduction. Despite the apparent hegemony of this cruel economic order, however, the novel introduces different moments and levels of disruption. Maria's constant pregnancies, for one, interfere with her work as a pesticide supervisor at the fruit company, where she neglects an invasion of fruit flies that destroys the crops. Maria deploys a powerful chemical counterattack to get rid of the plague. However, the excess of cyanide transforms the fruit in waste, causing the cancellation of all exports. Simultaneously, the temporeras initiate a strike to protest against wage reduction, using their menstrual blood to interrupt the farming of children and contaminate the fruit. And although the strike is smashed by the army and the fruit plant goes back to normalcy, Fruta Podrida shows with this that there are physical limits to human productivity that not even chemicals can overcome. Moreover, the novel shows how the commodification of food and medicine inevitably will generate a crisis in the reproduction of capitalism and the sustainability of life. Samantha Schweblin's novel Distancia de Rescate explores similar issues in the context of the soy fields in the Argentine country. In this case, the health risk posed to children by the uncontrolled use of glyphosate, one of the main components of Monsanto's pesticides. The treatment of this issue is quite different from fruitability, however. The novel unfolds through a hazy dialogue between Amanda, a woman intoxicated with glyphosate, and David, a strange boy who got poisoned by the same chemical years before. The dialogue leads to the discovery of two different pasts. First, the moment when David drinks poisoned water and is taken to a witch to save his life, to transfer the intoxicated part of his soul onto another body. And second, the moment when Amanda and her daughter Nina, fall fatally ill after contact also with contaminated water. At the end of the dialogue, we learn that while Nina, the daughter, is saved thanks to another spiritual migration practiced by the witch, Amanda, the mother, dies without the chance to avoid the split of her daughter's soul. The concept that links these two parts together is the impossibility to keep the rescue distance, or distancia de rescate, which is defined in the text as the calculation of space-time distance to save our children from nearby dangers. As many critics have pointed out, the difficulty to understand is one of the central aspects of the novel. The initial dramatic structure leads to an ambiguous narrative in which neither the narrator nor the reader know with certainty what is going on in the story. What is more, the word glyphosate does not appear in the book, and the description of the soil fields is vague. The crops are everywhere, almost imprisoning both the characters and the reader, but they cannot see them or even escape from them. In other words, the novel does not provide all the knowledge and all the tools to comprehend the risk around us. Instead, we need to look for clues to understand the logic of the events, and if we are lucky, to save ourselves. By obscuring the background of the intoxication, I believe that the novel is criticizing the invisibility of the health crisis in rural Argentina, where people that live near soy plantations are being sprayed with pesticides. This crisis remains out of the public eye despite overwhelming evidence that links the pollution of air and water by agribusiness corporation with the increase in cancer, skin problems, and risk of miscarriage. In this way, one of the merits of the novel is the affective capacity to make us feel rather than show the consequences of chemical pesticides. In other words, the novel reveals the nearness rather than the distance of the pesticides through the immediacy of their effects in daily life, revealing with this the capacity of literature to break down the global scale of the threats posed by chemical corporations. And I want to focus on one particular aspect of the novel, the witch who saves the life of intoxicated people by splitting their soul in other bodies. This witch, also called the women of the greenhouse, la mujer de la casa verde, represents the precariousness of the health system in rural zones. She's capable to cure headaches, vomit, skin ulcers, and miscarriages, which are all common maladies in the area. She also performs migrations in the souls of intoxicated people. According to David's mother, the migration of her son occurs in the following way. Si mudábamos a tiempo el espíritu de David a otro cuerpo, entonces parte de la intoxicación se iba también con él. Dividida en dos cuerpos, había chances de superarlo. Era la única manera que tenía de conservar a David. As we can see, the migration is all about preserving the body, even if this means to lose the soul. We counter here the same kind of biopolitics that we saw in Meruane Frutapoderia, in which the body must be preserved to ensure the continuity of the system, even if this means a reduction in the general quality of life. Indeed, the migration has similar kind of consequences. La transmigración se llevaría el espíritu de David a un cuerpo sano, pero traería también un espíritu desconocido al cuerpo enfermo. Algo de cada uno quedaría en el otro. In other words, instead of killing one, divide the disease among many. Because of the migration, David becomes a body without soul, an automaton, a contagious creature always looking to trap the spirit of other entities. And this is particularly significant at the end of the novel, when we realize that perhaps Nina's soul is inhabiting David's body. In other words, David acquires the condition of a transgenic crop, which are plants without soul that need to absorb the life of other plants and animals in order to grow. In this fashion, Schweblin shows how the soy industry produces zones of exclusion in which rural populations not only have to suffer the toxic effects of pesticides, but they are also becoming waste themselves. In that way, the novel's central enigma is not just about how the body exposes the global crisis of the pesticides, but also how we still normalize, despite all the evidence, a system of food production directly related to the disposability of people in the periphery. And I want to discuss the issue of normalization and the hegemony of agribusiness by focusing on Juan Cárdenas' novel, El Diablo de las Provincias. In this novel, monocrop agribusiness appears not just as a mode of production, but also as an ecological force looking to destroy any other forms of social relation and preclude any future other than that of the capitalist regime. And this is represented in the text through the bizarre idea of a cash crops conspiracy to take over the planet and cover all the territory with the same kind of plants. In this fashion, monocrop agribusiness becomes, in the novel, the purest expression of what Vandana Shiva calls a monoculture of the mind, a social structure that promotes capitalist development as the universal goal of humanity, and assimilating cultural, political, and even biological diversity under the paradigm of a single class, race, and genus of a species, and that of the capitalist white class. In the novel, a Colombian biologist returned to his hometown located somewhere in the Cauca Valley after 15 years of living in Europe, where he was a scientific researcher in the university. At first, the biologist is seduced by nostalgic sights of the rural landscape and the re-encounter with fruits, animal colors, and sounds he believed forgotten or extinct. After a more careful glance, however, the character detects something strange in the landscape. Oil palm plantations are growing like mushrooms in the city, together with highways, supermarkets, shopping malls, and real estate developments as a result of processes of accumulation by dispossession, or as the novel puts it, tierras robadas, deforestación salvaje y muertos por todo el país. The first part of the novel is articulated around this tension between nature in process of disappearing and the emergence of a new regime of exploitation. The evidence of environmental deterioration inspires the biologists to criticize the expansion of agribusiness in the city, denouncing its negative effects in front of students, relatives, and friends who nevertheless seem indifferent to the arguments of climate science and have quite conservative ideas about global warming. And I quote, "El hombre es el principal y más nocivo agente de cambio climático, incluso se le puede considerar un agente geológico. Estamos destruyendo el planeta, estamos modificando radicalmente toda la vida, pero no podemos parar, ya no podemos parar." All this induces a melancholic state in the biologists who seem to fall under solastalgia, a neologism coined by Glenn Albrecht to express the distress caused by climate change and the sense of powerlessness, especially against corporations, to influence the destruction of the environment, especially in the context of the plantation. In similar way to Meruane's Fruta Podrida and Schweblin's Distancia de Rescate, Cárdenas' novels inserts a moment of radical disruption of reality as a way to express the crisis generated by agribusiness. During the visit to an hacienda from the time of the sugar plantations, the biologist has a glimpse of the plot of certain plants to take over the world. And I quote from the novel, "El monocultivo niega el tiempo, lo cancela. Para el monocultivo no hay historia, ni hombre, solo eternidad, o sea, la nada absoluta. El monocultivo es la voluntad de Dios en la tierra." Also, algunas especies de plantas, entiende el biólogo, son la verdadera bestia del apocalipsis. El pasto está conspirando desde hace milenios para apoderarse del mundo y nos está usando a nosotros como esclavos. In other words, the sugarcane, the banana, the oil palm, even the grass, which humans have cultivated for centuries, conquering territories and enslaving other human beings to gain profit from these plants, have been actually using us to colonize every territory with them, exterminating whoever opposes to their expansion. As we can see, the visit to the hacienda, which is the symbol of Latin American contradictory agriculture, function as the doorway to grasp another reality, a vegetal, non-human reality in which the time of the history has been canceled, and there's only, as the novel puts it, the inhuman time of the plants that wish to get rid of all of the plants. For this reason, when the biologist is offered to work for a palm crop company to find a way to eliminate a plague that is affecting the production, a job that he at first refused, but then had to accept after pressure from a criminal group, the biologist cannot but think that his return to the countryside is part of a master plan of the plants to use him as an instrument. Accepting or rejecting this fate may not be an option anymore for him, but not because humans do not have a future in this plot, but because the very idea of future, for the moment at least, belongs to monoculture. From the reading of these novels, we can draw so important conclusions about the toxic place of agriculture in the 21st century. First, the depiction of the rural landscape as an artificial space, no longer natural, completely reshaped by technologies and infrastructure of extraction, as well as zones of toxic exclusion. Second, a complete alienation of food production, in which the plants appear as evil aliens or as vehicle for plagues, completely separated from human beings. This also points out a crisis in the politics of eating, as food become toxic, unhealthy, and designed to purposes different of human consumption. Third, in terms of labor, we do not see forms of slave or forced labor, as in the case of plantation novels and the rural novels of the 20th century. Instead, we see forms of underpaid, flexible, and precarious labor, often performed by women, who also must take care of the victims of toxic exposure, while the male characters are absent or even partake in the violence against nature and the most vulnerable. In other words, we see in these novels a focus on social reproduction rather than production. Finally, we also observe a worsening of the metabolic rift between society and nature due to the scale and intensity of the agricultural production, which impacts the soil, the water, and the air, and makes the environment unsafe for human and non-human beings. All this indicate the capacity of nature, as Nancy Fraser puts it, to buy back and to destabilize the conditions for the social reproduction of life under agribusiness model. To put it in different terms, if Cárdenas' novel contemplates the possibility of a world in which humans are just instruments of monoculture, Meruanes and Treblin's novels demonstrate that nature and society can absorb the cost of the reproduction and expansion of capital only up to a certain point before entering the realm of illness, then death, and extinction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastián. A lot to unpack here. Before I invite our discussant, Gisela Heffes, to deliver her response, just to remind folks that the chat is open both in Facebook, or if you're not logged into Facebook, you can also email us at kjc.info@nyu.edu to post your questions, and I will feed them back into our discussion later on. But now over to you, Gisela, to respond to Sebastián.
Thank you. First, before I get started, I would like to thank Sebastián for his kind invitation and for his thoughtful talk. I also would like to thank Jordana Mendelsohn and Laura Turigano for their warm welcoming, and Jens, of course, for moderating this event. In responding to Sebastián's work, I will summarize some of the main points for further discussion in the remaining time of this presentation and proceed to my questions. Needless to say, I've found your talk very enlightening, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity to offer some feedback. Your talk focused on the representation of monoculture pesticides and transgenic seeds in a group of novels from 21st century, which allowed you to expose the crisis of food production in the geographical margins of global capitalism. Your intention was to show how literature can serve as a way of understanding the alienation of food production in global capitalism and to imagine possible ways to get out of this crisis. In order to demonstrate this, you divided your presentation into two sections. First, you addressed Andrés Bello Silva a la agricultura de la zona tórrida, with the aim of showing how the notion of toxic agriculture is the outcome of a certain way of seeing agriculture as a capitalist enterprise, a masculine, military, and commercial view that predominated over other forms of farming throughout modernization. This is an interesting remark, since Bello's citizens are implicitly gender male, whereas the land, America, and nature generally are consistently feminized. In the second part of your talk, you examine three contemporary novels, Fruta Podrida by Lina Meruane, Distancia de Rescate by Samantha Schweblin, and El Diablo de las Provincias by Juan Cárdenas. The novels are from Chile, Argentina, and Colombia, three countries that you argued have been subjected to different forms of plantation capitalism throughout their history, from logging and fruit exportation in the case of Chile, to cereals and soy in the case of Argentina, and sugarcane and palm oil in the case of Colombia. By analyzing these narratives, you intended to demonstrate how these novels blur the boundaries between the real and the unreal to mediate the ecological imbalances created by monoculture and toxicity. In the first section, you offer some historical background of how Latin American literature has represented agricultural capitalism from its inception in the 19th century to 20th century industrialization. You then analyzed Bello Silva, which you read as a representation of the transition from an idealistic to a technical view of the American nature in the 19th century, in which agriculture will be, and I'm quoting you here, for the country what grammar is for the language. You read Bello's poem not only as a praise of farming life against the vices of the city, but also as a premise that violence towards nature is necessary to accomplish the mission of agricultural revolution. This is followed by an invitation for independent citizens to become a troop of new farmers and convert the wild soil in the new slave of human labor. Monoculture is a central tenet of your argument, for the notion of agricultural improvement following mixing wood is connected to the development of monoculture as a way to engage with global capital. Monoculture organizes farming in the direction of profit, one that reinforces privatization of land while reducing agricultural diversity and food subsistence, triggering a metabolic rift between society and nature, as you quoted Marx. This would be the reason for a slow but violent transition of agriculture to global capitalism in Latin America after the independence period, a process that you described as a gradual cycle of extraction and dispossession of resources from rural populations without ever reaching a stage of advanced development. This explains why the countryside was left in a stage of underdevelopment, one of the central topics of mid-20th century novels like Huasipungo, Doña Bárbara, Pedro Páramo, and El Lugar Sin Límites, all of which you suggested emphasized the isolation and archaism of the country. The tension between the periphery as a site of expropriation for the benefit of metropolitan centers, one that you described in terms of raw material providers, the rural, and consumption, the metropolitan areas, has been reinforced with the arrival of the Green Revolution, which you claim must be understood following Bandana Shiva as a process of maldevelopment based on the imposition of globalization, seed imperialism, and the monoculture of the mind. In the second section, you drew our attention to an important number of literary texts which have emerged in the last 2 decades and that engage with increasing presence of cash crop plantations and its devastating socio-environmental effects in Latin America. You defined these texts as novels or poetry of agribusiness, because they're shaped by a certain type of industrial farming that is not only dependent on monoculture, chemical pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, and transgenic seeds, but also has unclear ties with alien forces that regulate what happens in the daily life of people that live near the plantations. Your argument is that these novels represent the countryside as a site of experimentation where disguised forces artificially manipulate the ecological and social conditions of the territory to foster the production of agricultural commodities. The country, you argued, becomes a zone of toxic exclusion where both human and non-human entities are subjected to chemical violence. Moreover, you proposed that these novels of agribusiness can also be understood as a way to register the neo-extractive turn of agriculture in recent decades. Following Maristela Svampa, you describe this turn as a process of reorientation of Latin American economies towards primary extractive activities, as well as the result of the increasing commodification of biological processes by global corporations. This is a modality that allows capitalism to intervene in the reproduction of life in the planet. In particular, you focus on the specific ways that labor, gender, and nature are organized by agribusiness in the three novels. You also examine how the capacity of capitalism to intervene in all stages of food production generates a crisis in the process of reproduction of life. As a result, you read these novels as expressions of the ecological imbalances produced by agribusiness on a global scale. And following Schoeddecker, you conceived of these literary texts in two ways. First, not merely as a mimetic representation of environmental discourses, landscapes, or problems, but as environmentally embedded, structurally marked at the level of imagery, style, and form by the ruptures and rifts of ecological revolutions. Second, as narratives that, as you pointed out at the very beginning, blur the boundaries between the real and the unreal to mediate the crisis created by the appropriation of food by capital. You began discussing Fruta Podrida, a novel about the abuses of the fruit industry towards women through the story of two half-sisters who live in a rural town fiercely transformed into a homogeneous landscape of plantations and storehouses where economic profit is the most important aspect of social life. In your analysis, you raised a very important question. What happens when not just food, but also medicine is reorganized only for profit? In other words, what happens when not only production, but also reproduction is perverted by capitalism? You then move on to discuss Schweblin's novel, which develops in the soy fields of the Argentine countryside. In Distancia de Rescate, the health risks posed to children are the effect of the uncontrolled use of glyphosate, one of the main components in Monsanto's pesticides. Mainly, you attended to two important elements. Firstly, the role of what you call the witch, although in Spanish is referred to as La Mujer de la Casa Verde, which will be better off translated as the healer or the medicine woman, which is actually like a curandera. In your view, her performance implies a kind of biopolitics in which the body must be preserved to ensure the continuity of the system, even if this means the impoverishment in the general quality of life of the population. Secondly, your analysis was concerned with the following questions: how the body exposes the global crisis, and how we normalize a system of food production directly proportional to the disposability of people in the periphery. Finally, you discussed El Diablo de las Provincias, where you focused mainly on the normalization and hegemony of the monocrop agribusiness, which appears not just as a mode of production, but as an economic and ecologic force, looking to destroy any other form of social relation and preclude any future other than that of the capitalist regime. Here, you quoted Shiva again to argue that monocrop agribusiness becomes in the novel the purest expression of monoculture of the mind. You thereafter made a reference to what you define as a moment of radical disruption of reality that expresses the socio-ecological crisis generated by agribusiness. You connected this moment in relationship to the visit of the main character, the biologist, to an hacienda from the time of the sugar plantations, where he has a glimpse of the plan of certain plants to take over the world. Here, you claim, following the logic of the novel, that those raw materials that have been central to the economic history of Latin America, such as sugarcane, banana, palm oil, all crops that humans cultivated for centuries, conquering territories and enslaving other human beings for labor, have been actually using humans to colonize every territory with the same kind of plants and exterminate whoever opposes to their expansion. For this reason, you concluded that human beings may be the slaves of certain plants looking to dominate the world and not the other way around. Broadly speaking, you very well demonstrated throughout your presentation that we can identify in these narratives, first, forms of underpaid, flexible, and precarious labor often performed by the most vulnerable. Second, a worsening of the ecological conditions due to the scale and intensity of agricultural processes and the increasing use of chemical pesticides. And third, that the novels convey the capacity of nature to destabilize the conditions of capitalist reproduction and expansion. Of course, this is in very broad strokes the main argument of your talk. I would like now to move to my questions. As you will see, some are more general and some are more specific. And these questions have the purpose of generating a conversation and give you some thoughts to advance your work. My first question is methodological and refers to the premise of your argument. You begin your presentation addressing Bello Silva and how his poem calls to conquer nature, namely that nature should and will serve as the slave for humans. You then move forward almost 200 centuries to address three narratives of the neoliberal period to finish up with an examination of Cárdenas' novel, which reverses Bello Silva's claim and introduces the idea of human beings subjected to nature. In other words, humans will now serve as the slave for nature, especially some particular types of plants. Your argument has drawn some sort of circle, but the thread of these ideas is not fully connected. And I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit on something you haven't so far addressed, and it is how, in your argument, does the role of nature unfold from its passive position of a mere commodity to a subjective and active position of dominant, where humans become objectified to serve the master plan of the vegetal world. My second question is also methodological and is related to two different premises regarding how to read this text. On the one hand, you quoted Schrodecker's notion of reading literary text not only as mimetic representations of environmental discourses, landscapes, or problems, but as environmentally embedded, structurally marked at the level of imagery, style, and form by the ruptures and rifts of ecological revolutions. In the same vein, you claim that these narratives blur the boundaries between the real and the unreal to mediate the crisis created by the appropriation of food by capital. However, and throughout your analysis, I felt that your reading of both Bello's poem as well as of the three novels was focused on the mimetic representations rather than environmentally ingrained and structurally marked by the ruptures listed above. And I'm wondering if you could provide us with some examples of how you read this text beyond the mimetic representation and how, furthermore, they blur the boundaries between the real and the unreal to mediate the current crisis. My third question is historical and can be subdivided into several points. At the beginning of your talk, you claim that Bello Silva represents a transition from an idealistic to a technical view of the American nature in the 19th century, in which agriculture will be for the country what grammar is for the language. I agree that Bello holds an elitist perspective that calls for the Americans to regain their place in the rural space, while additionally dismiss the existence of native populations as well as the non-human world that inhabited those lands. Nevertheless, agricultural capitalism stretches back at least 2 centuries, since both the 17th and 18th centuries saw important economic, ecological, cultural, and political changes in the Spanish and Portuguese realms alike. Moreover, the extraction of precious metals had obsessed the Iberian colonizers since Columbus' first landing at Santo Domingo, and mining remained one of the most important economic activity throughout the colonial period. When mining took place in the interior, sugarcane production in Brazil, for instance, and elsewhere began in the 16th century along the coast. In this sense, Bello Silva can be viewed not as much as an inflection point, but as a continuum of what Walter Mignolo defined as the coloniality of nature. It is during this period that Ibero-American elites turned to monocrop agriculture, with the most important cash crops being cocoa, tobacco, and above all, sugar. So I'm not quite sure about the idealistic component that you mentioned, nor about the 19th century as a turning point. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on why you see Bello's poem as representative of the inception of agricultural capitalism in the 19th century. Following up with this, I have 2 additional questions. By examining Bello's poem, you suggested that it represents one of the foundational capital fictions of Latin America, but you left the political aspects aside. In other words, what about the political role that nature played during the period of post-independence? With this, I refer to 19th century writers such as Bello, but also like Sarmiento and Jose Maria Samper, just to give some examples, who created representations of nature as the rhetorical ground on which to stake their claims to political legitimacy. And moreover, isn't reflecting on Bello, Sarmiento, or Samper, for instance, under this single light, a potential mode of overshadowing the nuances, the fluctuations, and the contradictions that 19th century writers and politicians experienced and held vis-a-vis nature? My 4th question is about the concept brought forward by Vandana Shiva of the monoculture of the mind, a social structure that promotes capitalist development as the universal goal of humanity, assimilating cultural, political, and even biological diversity under the paradigm of a single class, race, and genus of a species, that of the capitalist white class. Furthermore, the agricultural improvement, which is directly linked to the violent transition of agriculture to global capitalism and the intensified appropriation of food production in the neoliberal era, entails, quoting Glenn Albrecht, which you quoted in your presentation, entails solastalgia, an overwhelming sense of powerlessness related to the expansion of plantations of monocrop, which prevent people to find comfort in the landscape. It is clear to me that the monoculture of the mind implies some sort of grief. At the same time, you argue at the beginning of the talk that your goal is to show how literature can imagine possible ways to get out of this crisis. And I'm wondering if you found in the narratives you analyzed a counter effect to this grim scenario, especially in light of what Boaventura de Sousa Santos defines in Epistemologias do Sul, Epistemologies of the South, as pensamento post-abyssal or post-abyssal thought, a methodology defined as an ecologia de saberes, an ecology of knowledges, an ecology because unlike the monoculture of the mind, it is based on the realization of a plurality of heterogeneous knowledges and conceives knowledge as interconocimiento or inter-knowledge. So what would be, in your view, an ecology of knowledges, a plurality of knowledges in the sense of Sousa Santos' formulation, and or how do you envision possible ways to get out of the crisis? And my fifth and last question is related to the theoretical and critical aspects of your presentation. If you could please talk a little bit about the theoretical and critical framework that informs your research. In closing, I would like to repeat that your research and talk have been both very insightful and thoughtful. What's more, it is a very important contribution to the field of environmental humanities, as well as to Latin American cultural studies. And I will be more than happy to continue this conversation here, as well as elsewhere in the near or more distant future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gisela. Maybe, Sebastián, you want to quickly respond to some of Gisela's points. There are a few questions already in the chat. So if you want to go first, and then I'll pick the questions that have arrived so far. If anyone wants to throw another one on the table, you can still post in the chat or email them to kjc.info@nyu.edu.
Thank you so much, Jens, and thank you, Gisela, for such, first, you put it better than me on the whole lecture, and the questions are so thorough and intelligent, and I hope to be able to answer them, and maybe not completely right now, in the future. And I think that I'm going to start with the idea of nature as passive, and how it transitioned to another concept of nature, in which nature is has rebelled against human control. And I'm going to say first that this idea of nature as passive is a construction of capitalism, which sees the natural world as this standing reserve of resources available for exploitation and experimentation, and also capable of self-replenishing, or in other words, eternally renewable nature. And this is completely the opposite of how nature works. It's a system in which species interact all the time in connection to the physical environment. So the problem is that every time that capitalism makes progress, there is a further alteration of the system. And because this system is fragile, this produces more and more negative effects, like wildfires and droughts, and caused by global warming, or viruses like the one we are seeing in the pandemic. And this is what Nancy Fraser calls the capacity of nature to bite back, to respond in very violent ways to the intervention of the natural system by capital. So rather than saying that we are slave of nature, I will say that we are a slave of the negative effects that capitalism has produced in the natural world. And I think that this is the meaning behind Cárdenas' idea that certain plants are looking to dominate the world. This means that we're no longer in control, which is completely fine. The problem is that the humanity and specific groups of people more than others are seeing the effects of exploiting nature. And we're almost incapable to deal with this, despite efforts to win back some sort of balance in our interaction with nature. And I think that this is a source of grief, regarding to your question about that, but in the sense of the anxiety, the uncertainty that climate change produces in us, and the fact that we're no longer capable to see a future, unless, of course, is the future that the capitalist nation agrees for us, like cutting carbon emissions by 2050, right? That kind of future that they think is possible. And that's why I emphasize that part in the decision of the biologists to become an instrument of the monoculture, because that future belongs to monoculture, not to us. And I think there is another meaning of this idea of nature as the master, and I think that has to do with the capital as becoming more and more technological and intelligent. So the idea that certain plants, genetically modified plants, are going mad, for me makes completely sense, because we see that capitalism is being more and more independent of human control. It is itself going out of control, although it's always been part of the history of capitalism being wild and out of control. But I think this is more important now, and I think that this can be useful to respond to your question about history, like the jump between like from Andrés Bello to 21st century, and also to respond to the idea of the coloniality of nature. You are completely right. Monoculture began in the colonial period, but at the same time, the imperial nations, Portugal and Spain, didn't become capitalists because of this. Almost the opposite. They were very backward in relation to England in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century. So the real change, I think, for agriculture occurs with the globalization of capitalism in the 19th century. And I think that this is the moment when monocultures begin to have the place they have today. And this is inside global divisions of labor that are not similar to the colonial period. For example, the US and certain European countries are also monocultural and leaders of monocultural production. But I think you're right. Agricultural capitalism has at least 2 centuries more in Latin America. But the idea is perhaps seen in the history of capitalism and the history of modernity as a history of continuity with the colonial period, but also discontinuity. And there are other discontinuities, not only in regards to the colonial period, but also within the history of capitalism itself in the last 2 centuries. One of them will be the use of nature to construct the nation state in the 19th century, as you mentioned, in regard to the question of political sovereignty. And another is the capitalism becoming more and more technological. And I guess, and I finish with this, trying to respond to your question about methodology, by thinking about these discontinuities, because and these are the sources, these discontinuities are the source of the mimetic breakdown that I try to convey in my analysis of these novels. One example could be Cárdenas' monocultural conspiracy. Another could be the migration of souls in the Estancia de Rescate, or the hospital trading organs in the international markets. And I think that these are moments in these novels in which reality cannot be imitated anymore. And this is because there are changes, radical changes occurring in the structural level, and they cannot be said clearly right, that are hard to explain or to make visible. And my approach to literature is that literature is a way of knowing, a form of knowledge that is also sensorial and affective, but also cognitive, to know these changes, a way to know these changes that are occurring in the structural level. And I guess that this is connected to your question about the ecology of knowledge. But my reading of this novel is that they convey precisely the opposite, the poverty of knowledge of agribusiness. We think that genetic manipulation is the most advanced kind of knowledge, but it's actually the opposite. It's something that nature and people have been doing for centuries. The thing that corporations did was to patent this, to privatize this knowledge. But definitely we need to include other kinds of knowledge, natural, indigenous, popular knowledge to get out of the crisis. And I guess that the novels, what I'm trying to convey is the poverty of knowledge, the lack of knowledge that is actually involved in agribusiness operations.
Maybe if I can interject there, Sebastián, because we have probably another 12 minutes or so, but there are 3 questions in the talk, so maybe I can pivot to those. Very interesting answer. Of course, there's a lot to continue here. Now, starting with the very category of nature, do we really still want to keep using that category, or is that precisely what is at least co-productive of this alienation effect, no, that Marx thinks about when he reflects on the metabolic rift. I have a question from Diego Baena, and I'm going to read it. He says, I'm noticing the use of narrative strategies in these neo-agricultural novels comparable to a variety of sources, particularly what in literary studies we would usually call expanded or magical realism and naturalism, no? The latter being highly evocative of 19th and early 20th century so-called social novels. So his question is, and I quote again, do you see the existence of a critical naturalism in these novels that does not merely reinforce cults to specifically professional scientific knowledge with its Eurocentric and institutional biases, but on the other hand, question official discourses and practices of development and knowledge creation? Is there room, in short, for such an apparently obsolete aesthetic as naturalism in today's cultural landscape? Do you want to?
Yes, of course. If I understood correctly, it's about, I understand the last part, but is he referring to social novels or
right? I think the question is very much about how these novels actually repackage traditions that are prevalent in this literary series or canon of modern Latin American narrative that you've unpacked for us. No? So what about naturalism specifically? And I think I'm sort of off the top of my head speculating that Diego might also refer to the return of the novela de la tierra and its ramifications, no, in these more contemporary texts.
Yeah, thank you so much for unpacking the question, Jens, because it's a very interesting and productive question to think about novels of agribusiness, of how I call them. Because there are, of course, recuperations and continuities from previous aesthetic trends and poetics of the novel. And I guess one aspect that I've been thinking about a lot is the idea of naturalism, but under the idea of post-naturalism, right? Or even neo-naturalism. Because there is evidence of how nature has been altered, right? And to answer a little bit your question, James, about nature, right? Because there is a concept of nature that cannot be denied, to put it that way, which is, like the argument of, for example, climate science. There is nature, biophysical nature, in which there are interactions, and those interactions can be broken because of capitalist intervention. So one of them would be the alteration through genetic manipulation or through other forms of even larger scale manipulation of the environment, in which nature is not anymore just this biophysical system, but it's also something else, right? Something post-natural, insofar as is technologically manipulated, technologically altered, and it doesn't appear anymore as it used to be, right? So there is a change in the natural, in the representation of nature in these novels, because of the very changes that nature is experiencing or suffering, right? So that would be one way to put it.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, it's an interesting and fascinating discussion now, because we could, I guess, go on thinking endlessly about where actually technology starts being something else than nature. No, one could argue that is also part of it. But we have another 3 questions. Gabriel Giorgi asks if you could talk a little bit more about the relation between toxic agriculture and race, especially, but not only in El Diablo de las Provincias. Steve Butts says, and going back to the parallel that you establish between agriculture, what agriculture is to the land as grammar is to language. How do you see that, or what would be the equivalent to this comparison in these more modern novels? What is the contemporary agrotoxic novel to contemporary capitalist land use? And lastly, I throw them all at you, and then you can see if you want to respond to them all or unpick one or two of them. Emilio Gordito says, and he's en Estados Unidos dice, existe la nature's writing como un conjunto de escrituras sobre y con la naturaleza. En la escritura latinoamericana pareciera prevalecer o pareciera que este lugar de escritura se atribuyera a las cosmovisiones indígenas, ¿no? En la producción ficcional, estos ejercicios de escritura con la naturaleza son difíciles de encontrar, a excepción de trabajos de Rivera Garza. ¿Por qué crees que esto sucede en la producción escritural latinoamericana?
Wow, so interesting questions, and I guess I'm going to start with the second one, which is about what would be the equivalent of agriculture grammar for the language in the 19th century and agriculture for most part of the 19th and 20th century. And I guess in the first century, it's definitely biotechnology, I would say, and in combination with management. And I think that those are the only knowledges or the prevalent knowledges in agricultural production today. And this is important because it's not about production anymore. Maybe it's about managing production, and it's about privatizing knowledge and making profit out of it. And that's maybe the role of one of the prevalent roles of biotechnology in management, or at least when biotechnology is appropriated by capitalism. And there is an important change there too, in moving from the hacendado, from the patron, right, the lord, to this unknown, anonymous owners of this transnational agribusiness corporation, completely separated from the territory. And I think that that's a part of what is going on in these novels. There are not bosses, lords anymore. There are alien forces, right? We don't know where the power is coming and where the toxins are coming. We know for sure, but at the same time, we can see them. And I guess that's part of the certain transformation of knowledge into something that is completely specialized, that we cannot access anymore as people that can produce and eat what we produce. Totally the opposite, right? We're separated more and more by knowledge and farming from food. And in relation to race in El Diablo de las Provincias, because it's such an important topic in Cárdenas narrative in general, right? And I like to answer this question in thinking in other books by Cárdenas, right? Because there is the presence of race in El Diablo de las Provincias, but I don't see them that is see it as clearly as, for example, Los Estratos, right? Where there is an actual journey towards the problem of race in the Cauca Valley and the Pacific Coast. I guess the question of race is important to address what Gisela was saying about the coloniality of nature, because it's directly related to plantation capitalism, right? Which is also based on grounded on racialization of certain groups of people, right? So race will be one way to talk about that continuity, to talk about that coloniality of nature through racialization, and that's present in Colombia, and El Diablo de las Provincias is of course portraying part of that. But I think it's even more important in other novels by Juan Cárdenas, in which there are quests, there are journeys towards territories that are being occupied until now for former slaves, for example, quilombos and such. So I think it's important to talk about that continuity, that of the coloniality of nature, but at the same time, there is something different about the racialization and about the labor that they perform, right? Like if you remember in the hacienda, they are servers in the dinner, but the plantation is completely empty. There's no workers there, right? There's no workers. It's just plants because these plantations are automatic, are like machines, right? Crops are like machines. So it's very interesting, I guess, the question to talk also about the plantation scene and in regard to that particular novel, but I'm gonna stop there because I don't want to get in trouble.
Oh. I think we're probably also hitting the half-hour mark for our panel. So there's one or two other questions, but which I think I'll just send your way, Sebastián, over email, and then you can continue through this medium. Please. Because they're long and complex question. Thanks everyone for their remarks and their participation. Thanks Gisela for this fantastic response that really unpacked the issues that Sebastián's talk put on the table. Thank you everyone for being with us, and I guess it's for me to wish everybody a relaxing end of the week, and please make sure to visit the KJCC website for the upcoming events. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jens, and thank you so much, Sebastián, and it has been a pleasure. And we hopefully can maybe reconvene at some point in person and continue the conversation, because there's a lot of things to talk about, and it's very interesting. So thank you both, and thank you those that are in the back that we don't see and have been here for an hour and a half listening.
Yeah, I really hope so. We can reconvene and talk about this. And thank you so much for unpacking my lecture so well. So well put the whole argument and your questions. I hope I can answer them properly, and they will be very useful to finish this paper, which I hope it will be part of it will be a chapter in my book project. So I really appreciate the questions and all your comments.
Wonderful, which we're all looking forward to see in print, hopefully sooner than later. Thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.